So this is an RTX 3060 Ti LHR edition by Zotac, and this specific model is called the Twin Edge. Now this GPU has an 8GB of VRAM and it is using the GDDR6 memory. The TDP of this GPU comes in at 200 watts, but of course we are going to undervolt or power limit it while mining. And it takes only a single 8-pin to power this GPU, so powering this GPU for your rig is going to be fairly straightforward. All you need is one VGA or 8-pin PCIe strand like this coming from your power supply, and you need a splitter whereby one end of the splitter will be going into the GPU and another end would be going into your riser. The 3060 Ti has been the favorite GPU for miners since its release, and we are going to test out the hash rate for this LHR edition on Ethereum, Ergo, Ravencoin, and also Flux. See if it is still any good. Figuring out the overclock and undervolt settings, talk about the profitability as of right now, and I'll give you, my final verdict and my personal opinion about this GPU specifically for mining. I should say that this card is really small compared to the Gainwood RTX3060's 12GB version that I've just tested about 2 weeks ago. Just look how much smaller this 3060 Ti is compared to the RTX 2060. Alright, so without me talking too much, let me just put this on my test bench and start testing the hash rate and find the best overclock settings, and you will see the result in a bit. So before we proceed any further, here's a quick disclaimer. Understand that each and every GPU is different. Even if you have the same exact model as what I have right over here, your overclock settings will be different. And also, silicon lottery, some cards can handle much higher overclock than the average. So my overclock settings may or may not be suitable for your GPU. So overclock at your own risk and just use it as a reference on what you can expect from this GPU. So with that get out of the way, let me just pop this on my test bench, start hashing, start mining, do a bunch of tests, and you will see the result right now. For this specific card that I've tested here, the LHR kicked in immediately after I launched the miner. But luckily, T-Rex miner will auto-adjust the LHR settings if the LHR is detected. At stock settings, this RTX 3060 Ti LHR card is getting about 38 MHz per second mining Ethereum. So for wattage, just like a lot of LHR cards out there, it fluctuates a lot, ranging from around 174 watts to 186 watts. So this is what you can expect to get mining any coin that is on Ethash or ETC hash algorithms. After that, as usual, I bumped up the fan speed and started adding memory clock. At plus 1200 on the memory clock, I was getting above 45 MHz per second at around 195 watts, which is close to the 200 watts TDP. Now, dropping the core by 502 dropped a couple of watts, but it is negligible. Adding another 100 on the memory clock, I was getting around 0.5 MHz per second more, sitting at around 46. When I went higher on the memory clock to plus 1400, the hash rate gain is very minimal, I would say, and the LHR kicked in again. So I left the mem back at plus 1300 at that point, and I started locking the core clock. So locking the core clock at 1100 with MSI Afterburner, I was getting around 44 to slightly above 45 MHz per second at 119 watts to 129 watts, which is way more efficient and the card runs significantly cooler. But for some unknown reasons, in this particular round of testing, the hash rate started getting lower after a couple of minutes. So I restart the miner with the same settings, which is lock core clock at 1100 and plus 1300 on the MEM. I was getting around 42 to 43 MHz per second at 110 to 119 watts. After that, I did try locking the core clock at other numbers like 1050, 1200, 1300 and 1350. Basically, efficiency-wise, they are pretty much the same. So granted, the efficiency is more or less the same, I use command lines to set my settings in T-Rex miner batch file, locking the core clock at 1350 and memory clock at 1300. With this setting, I was getting 43.2 to 44.7 MHz per second with an average of 118 watts mining Ethereum. And out of curiosity, I added the batch file and bumped the mem to 1500, and I got about extra 0.5 MHz per second, ranging from around 43.8 to 45.1 MHz per second occasionally with an additional 3 to 4 watts. If you were to ask me, 1300 on the mem in this case is like the sweet spot. With a locked core clock of 1350 and plus 1500 on the memory clock, I went ahead and dual mined Ethereum with Alephium with the latest version of T-Rex miner. I let the miner runs for a good amount of time, and I was able to get around 44 MHz per second for Ethereum and around 640 MHz per second on Alephium at 150 watts. But I should note that with 1500 on the memory clock, I did get invalid shares. So again, 1300 on the memory clock is just better, at least when Ethereum mining is involved. On the Autolycos algorithm mining Ergo, this algorithm is also being targeted by the LHR but not as pronounced. With stock settings, I was getting 69 MHz per second at around 119 watts. I bumped up the memory clock to 1300 and reduced the core clock by 502. It was getting only 85 MHz per second at around 126 watts, upward to 140 watts. And this is the quirky part about this GPU and also some other LHR GPUs as well. If you have seen some other hash rate reference, this card can get up to 130 to 140 MHz per second mining Ergo, but as we are towards the upper limit of the clock speeds, it is still a far cry away from what people are getting. So here comes the quirky part. I dropped the power limit to 90%, nothing happened. I dropped the power limit to 80%, nothing happened as well. I dropped the power limit to 70%, nothing happened again. Neither the hash rate nor the wattage was dropping. 60% on the power limit, no changes again. And when I dropped the power limit to 50%, which is the absolute minimum it could go, basically the table turned. Immediately, I see the hash rate going up and the wattage dropping. So I was getting 133 MHz per second at 99 watts. Which to me is amazing efficiency right there. Now I could leave it just like this as I think this is already very good. But since I was testing this GPU, why not I went a step further. I saw the GPU clock speed was hovering around 800 MHz, so I went ahead and locked the core clock at 800 with MSI Afterburner. The wattage did drop, but so goes the hash rate. When I locked the clock speed at 880, I was getting 133 to 134 MHz per second at 95 watts. After that, I went ahead and locked the clock speed slightly higher at 900. It became a little bit unstable. I got around 132 MHz per second to 133 MHz per second at 96 watts. Then I locked the clock speed at 1000, it went back to 80 over MHz per second, and that's where I stopped. So I closed the miner and reset the settings at MSI Afterburner. I went ahead and set the overclock settings in T-Rex miner's batch file. The first setting that I tried was putting a locked core clock at 880 with a memory clock of 1300. And I got lower hash rate than what I was getting just now using MSI Afterburner. This time round, I was getting 116 MHz per second at 90 watts power consumption, which is also lower than just now. It is weird, and I don't know why. All I could do is just trial and error. So I went ahead and locked the core clock at 1100. Right off the bat, I got 130 MHz per second at 95 watts. So I closed the miner, locked the core clock at 1200, and I got 135 MHz per second at 97 watts this time. So basically, slightly more hash rate and wattage efficiency maintains. So I went ahead and locked the core clock at 1300. I got less than 100 MHz per second straight away. So I guess locking the core clock with MSI Afterburner and internally within the batch file are very different. Then I lowered the core clock a bit and tried 1250. Basically, I also got less than 100 MHz per second. So after that, I went back with a locked core clock of 1200 and increased the MEM to 1500. With these settings, I get 136 MHz per second at 98 watts. I also tried 1600 on the MEM. Basically, the hash rate gain was negligible. The great thing is, this GPU did not even crash at 1600 on the memory clock. So I would say the best settings that I'm happy with is a locked core clock of 1200 with 1500 on the memory clock. 135 MHz per second at 98 watts stable. One thing that I also want to mention is that with this kind of efficiency, the card runs really cool. With 60% fan, I'm getting 44 degrees Celsius. For reference, my ambient is at 26 degrees Celsius. Now, this is important because we know that it has a lot of headrooms. In the event that your GPU is being rigged up with a couple of other cards next to it, you know that there are still plenty of headrooms to play with when it comes to the fan speed and also temps for your GPU. Now let's move on to things that are hotter. At stock settings, this RTX 3060 Ti is getting around 24.9 MHz per second at 199 watts mining Ravencoin. Right off the bat, it is already using the full TDP and this card is running at 66 degrees Celsius at an ambient of 26 degrees Celsius on my open air test bench. So definitely we need to power limit this card later. But first, I raised the MEM by 1000. I got slightly above 29 MHz per second at the same 199 watts. Bumping up the core by 100, it did nothing. It is like 0.01 to 0.02 extra megahash. So I bumped the core to plus 150 and see what it did. Again, it did nothing. But I left it here because from my experience, adding a little bit of core clock will be a little bit more stable for mining with the prop power based algorithm like Ravencoin, which uses the Kapao algorithm. Next, I kept increasing the memory clock. At 1400 on the MEM, I was getting around 30.6 MHz at the same 199 watts. Bumping up to 1500, the hash rate did increase, but I got invalid shares. So I restart the miner and set the memory clock to 1450 and begin power limiting. So as usual for Ravencoin, the more power limit you drop, the more efficient you will get, but for the wattage you drop, you lose some hash rate as well. I play around with the settings a bit. I wanted to get 30 MHz per second on this card, judging based on what it is capable of doing. In the end, I settled with 83% on the power limit, plus 150 on the core clock and plus 1475 on the memory clock, and I did not get any invalid shares so far with this setting. And I was getting 30.6 MHz per second at 165 watts, and the temperature sits at 57 degrees Celsius at 75% fan. So definitely there is still some headroom, but in the event that we are rigging this up and the heat starts building up around the rig, we can just reduce the power limit to reduce the temps and also get better efficiency. So that's all about Ravencoin. The first thing for Flux is testing out which miner is giving me a better hash rate. For this specific GPU, MiniZ miner is giving me around 2 solutions per second more than the G miner at stock clocks. So I went with MiniZ miner for the rest of the test. On stock settings, I was getting 53 to 54 souls per second at 197 to 199 watts. Again, full TDP basically. For Flux mining, overclocking is always a pain because the hash rate does not seem to increase much and it takes time for the hash rate to reflect the new applied settings. So when I raised the MEM by 1200, it is still getting around 53 to 54 sols per second at the same wattage. Then I started adding core clock to it. At plus 100 on the core, I got an additional 0.5 sols per second on average. I raised the core again to plus 150, I was getting around 55 to 56.3 sols per second at 199 watts. Adding a little bit more core to plus 175, I got 56 sols per second to slightly above 57 sols per second at the same power consumption. With this, I move on to adding a little bit more memory clock, and unsurprisingly, it did nothing. So I started power limiting. Basically, this is the same with Ravencoin just now. Dropping the power limit will drop the hash rate and wattage, and it gets a little bit more efficient every time you lower the power limit. At 90% power limit, it dropped about 2 sols per second and 20 watts. At 80% power limit, it dropped another 2 sols per second and 19 watts. At 70% power limit, it dropped another 2 sols and 20 watts. I also tried dropping to 65% power limit and also 60% power limit. I would say I'm fine with 75% power limit, as I was getting 50 sols per second to 51 sols per second at 150 watts. The GPU temp is sitting at 53 degrees Celsius with 75% fan speed, so plenty of headroom still. At the point of recording this video, it is really an awkward time to talk about profitability, as Ethereum will move to proof of stake in a couple of months if there is no delay. So as Ethereum goes away, the network hash rate from GPU miners will be distributed to other coins that are profitable, like Ethereum Classic, Ravencoin, Ergo, Flux, and so on. By then, the profitability will be very different compared to what we are going to see right over here. So, keying in the hash rate and wattage that I have gotten here into what to mine, with an 8 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity cost, this is what we get. Not to my surprise, coins that are using the proc power-based algorithm come in at the top. Maybe because I've gotten a silicon lottery and this card does better in proc power-based algorithm. Moving on, we have Ethereum coming in at $1.84 per day after electricity, and then we have Ergo, Ethereum Classic, then Flux coming in at a shy of $1.37 per day. Now, there is one more thing that we have tested just now, which is dual mining Ethereum and Alephium. Putting in all the numbers, we are getting $2.13 per day after electricity cost, which is higher than mining the proc power-based coins just now like Zero, Ravencoin, and Firo. So this is the profitability at the point of recording this video. Now, I should say that I'm very surprised with the performance of this GPU on the Kapao algorithm from what I have tested. So far, for any proc power-based algorithm like the Firo Power as well, expect the similar performance, but again, it might be the silicon lottery for me. For Ethereum and Ergo, what I'm able to get are actually the average based on what I've seen from other tests, and maybe for Ergo, this GPU right over here can really achieve the similar hash rate at a significantly lower wattage than the average that I've seen. And I should say that this GPU can really go hard on the memory clock. I went all the way to 1600 and it did not even crash. But of course, the hash rate just doesn't go much higher beyond 1300 on the memory. And from 1500 to 1600, basically the hash rate gain is negligible. On the Kapao algorithm, I started getting rejected shares when I bumped the MEMS to 1500. So in the end, I dialed it back down a bit to 1475 and I have no issues anymore. So what's the final verdict? As this is an LHR card, it is being limited in Ethereum mining as well as other Ethash algorithm. But with dual mining together with Alephium, we can increase the profitability by quite a bit, making it a little bit more profitable. On Autolycos algorithm mining Ergo, this card is definitely a little bit quirky, but once you found the right settings, it's rather efficient, I would say, consuming less than 100 watts. On proc power-based algorithm and also Zell hash mining Flux, this card is doing well I would say. The overall performance of this card is slightly under the RTX 3070 LHR edition, and I would say less than 10% difference only. But in my region, this GPU right now is about 20% cheaper than the RTX 3070 LHR edition. So from this perspective, this is kind of a value pick if you were to ask me, as we know that the RTX 3070 is like the king of mining efficiencies. So that's all about this GPU hash rate review, overclock settings, and profitability. Unfortunately, it is hard for me to really discuss about ROI now, as things may change very drastically after Ethereum moves to proof of stake. But one thing for sure, mining is not doomed. Next up, I'll be reviewing another GPU by Nvidia as well, so if you want to have a comparison between the hash rate and profitability as of right now, make sure you subscribe to my channel and turn on your notification bell so that you don't miss out when I upload that video. With that said, thanks for watching, and I will see you when I see you. Peace out.